You're listening to the Effective Statistician podcast, episode number 60, Subgroup Identification Using Sites and Its Practical Challenges. An interview with Andy Nicholls. Welcome to the Effective Statistician with Alexander Schacht and Benjamin Pieske, the weekly podcast for statisticians in the health sector designed to improve your leadership skills, widen your business acumen, and enhance your efficiency. In terms of leadership, I'm pretty excited that we will have an upcoming webinar. It happens on May 30th and it's about mastering the art and the science of influential communication for statisticians. I'm doing this together with Gary. Gary will actually be the main presenter, and in this webinar you'll learn about challenges when communicating, the keys for you to become more influential. We'll also talk about challenging audiences and why it's important to have a strong start. Finally, we will give you 3 things you can do now to improve your communication. So go to theeffectivestatistician.com/webinar and there you can register and enroll for this. Also, please tell your colleagues about it because I'm pretty sure they will benefit from it as well. So don't miss out this opportunity to become more effective and register for the webinar at, again, theeffectivestatistician.com/webinar. So in today's episode, we will talk about sites, which is really about the identification of subgroups in clinical trials. You can actually also use it in observational data, but we will focus on clinical trials. With Andy Nicholls, we will go step by step through this really elegant approach and also apply it to a practical example. The podcast overall is created in association with PSI, a global member organization dedicated to leading and promoting best practice and industry initiatives. Join PSI today to further develop your statistical capabilities with access to really nice special interest groups, the video on demand content library, free registration to all PSI webinars, and much more. By the way, you can see a presentation about Andy Nicholls' webinar on the video on demand content as well. So there's really low rates for becoming a member. Just check out and go to psiweb.org to learn more about PSI activities and become a PSI member today. Welcome to another episode of The Effective Statistician. And this time we have a very technical topic. We talk about subgroup identification. And there has recently been a webinar from PSI organized about supervised and unsupervised learnings and the pitfalls in it. And Andy gave a very nice presentation in there. We talked about a different presentation, actually my cluster presentation at an earlier episode. So just scroll back in your podcast player and you'll find that. But today we talk about subgroup identification and its practical challenges. Welcome, Andy, to the show. Hi, Andy. How are you doing?
Hi, Alexander. Very well, thank you. Cold this morning, but otherwise good.
Yeah, as we recorded, it's snowing outside and it's pretty cold in January and of 2019. And Andy, would you like to introduce you a little bit? What your career has been and what brought you into subgroup identification?
Sure. Yeah. So I've had a bit of a strange career compared to most people. I started out in a nice standard way, completing my MSc in medical statistics about 12 or 13 years ago, and started working for GSK, where I am now. But after 4 or 5 years working in neurosciences, I left GSK to go work for a data science consultancy firm called Mango Solutions, who specialize in the R language, if people have come across them. So I was there for 6 years and ended up working across a variety of different sectors. Still a little bit plugged into the pharmaceutical industry, but working on all kinds of projects, small and large, with people who sometimes just wanted to explore their data a little bit more. Sometimes there were like Internet of Things type projects. There's a huge variety of work. But after 6 years, I left and came back to GSK almost 2 years ago to the day, and that took me into the respiratory area, where this analysis that we're going to talk about today came from.
Okay, very good. In terms of your data mining time at Mango Solutions, did that help you to increase your knowledge about, let's say, these more advanced techniques to find subgroups and things like that?
Yeah, so some of the stuff actually I've picked up since I came back. So it's a bit of a mix, but I suppose Mango opened me up to the ideas beyond what you would typically learn as a statistician. So I guess up until the point that I went there, a lot of my work had been very, very standard, especially around neuroscience. We're fitting a lot of kind of mixed models, and I guess the subgroup analyses that I'd always been exposed to were always kind of very predefined subgroup analyses. There was nothing really exploratory. So at Mango, where I worked with a lot of, I guess, career data scientists, you'd call them, people who don't necessarily have a statistical background, I was exposed to a lot of different ways of working. And in fact, actually now, since this analysis is completed, I've moved into a statistical data science group within GSK. So it's really actually shaped my career and where I've gone with it. So it's given me it's definitely influenced what I've been able to do and where my interests have lay.
That's great, because I think such a kind of sidestep can bring completely different perspectives into things. I myself have worked for nearly 10 years in neuroscience, and I know kind of running mixed models on kind of all different scales, from depression to schizophrenia and pain and so on. And yes, that can be quite standard at times. In terms of the COPD studies that we're talking about, can you give a little bit of background where this is coming from?
Okay, so I'll keep calling it SLS, so I should say what that stands for. It's the Salford Lung Study. So cool because it was run in the Salford area of Manchester in the UK. In fact, it was actually two studies. There was one study for COPD and one study for asthma. So if anyone goes on to read about this afterwards, it's worth being aware of that distinction. So the study itself was a 12-month study. It was designed as an effectiveness study as opposed to an efficacy study. So you can think of it as kind of almost striking a balance between like a real-world cohort study and a traditional randomized control trial. So it was randomized, but it was an open-label study. And in terms of study visits to assess the primary endpoint, which was a reduction in, which is the mean annual rate of moderate and severe exacerbations. This was all done through electronic health records, and there were the study visits were effectively confined to the beginning of study and the end of study. So it was a large study, nearly 3,000 subjects, and there are a lot of endpoints in the study, and a lot of data challenges, actually, because when you try and combine real-world data from the electronic health records with a finite amount of standard randomized control trial data, it brings about a lot of challenges. So it's very, 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 very novel, very, very interesting study.
So is that, would you call that a pragmatic study then?
Yes, I think that's a good word to use to describe it.
Yeah. So a randomized trial, but making it as close to the real world as possible, just with adding the randomization, which then makes it a trial rather than an observational study.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah, there's a lot of other elements to it as well. So, for example, the inclusion-exclusion criteria were designed to make sure that we had a kind of all-comers population. So traditionally, if you're running a COPD study, you might, for example, ensure that you don't have any subjects with comorbid asthma. You're also likely to remove current smokers. And those types of subjects were permitted to be part of this study. So as well as the design in terms of the follow-up of the subjects, it was also very open in terms of the types of subjects that you would see in the real world.
That is actually one of the things that I really love about these more kind of observational settings and real-world data settings, is that you get a very good variety of patients at baseline. So you get a lot of that, which is kind of, if you want to run a phase 2 study just to understand whether your drug actually works or not, is really not something that you would like to have, because it adds a lot of variability. But I think for the tasks that we are talking about today, it's actually a very, very nice feature, because you can explore across a variety of patient populations how the drug works and where there are differential effects. So it's in this part of the questions that you are asking about a treatment, it's really a feature and not a bug.
Absolutely.
Okay, so then you wanted to go into subgroup analysis. There's a couple of different reasons for why you want to explore treatment effects across different subgroups. What were the specific reasons for this COPD study?
So one of the key motivations for this study was that because it was a lot like a real world study, in the fact that we had this broad patient population, there was an opportunity that you wouldn't normally get in a as you say, a phase 2 study or even phase 3 confirmatory study, to explore subgroups. There are patient subgroups that aren't normally part of those trials. So again, going back to the smokers, for example, so you're able to see how effective your drug is in these populations. So that was a real key motivation for the team. And ultimately, if you think about the motivations behind running such a study in the first place, what you're trying to do is, as you say, see how the study, see how the drug performs in the real world. And in the real world, these differences in patient phenotypes are going to result in differences in the effectiveness of the drug. So that was the primary driver. We're also lucky, of course, because we're collecting data across all of these different subjects, and because we have all this electronic health data, we were also lucky enough to have a large number of variables at our disposal. So if you're going to run an exploratory analysis to try and find subgroups like this, it obviously helps the more variables or features in the data science world that you have to explore. So there was the interest from the study design, and with that, we also had the ability to do it in terms of the variables that we could look at.
In terms of the endpoint, so you also had a couple of different endpoints that you looked into. So sometimes it's also interesting to see whether the endpoints are different, affected by subgroups. So is the efficacy, more or less consistent, but are there safety signals for specific subgroups? Did you look into these topics as well?
No, we didn't. Actually, in the study, there was a wealth of data collected on pneumonias, for example, as an SAE of special interest. But this was purely efficacy focused exploratory piece of work. So I wouldn't necessarily rule out that in future, but there was nothing. There was no other endpoints explored other than the primary exacerbation endpoint.
Okay, so let's look into kind of a couple of different challenges for finding relevant subgroups. One of the topics is pre-specification and post-hoc. Were all your kind of variables pre-specified, and how did you pre-specify them?
Yes, they were. Is the is the short answer. So, even though first I should be very clear to point out that this was a post hoc piece of work that was carried out. It was the intent of the team to do this from, I think, right from the start, but it wasn't pre-specified in the SAP. So what we did was we wrote a post hoc SAP where we outlined all the work that we were going to perform. We determined all of the inputs to the sides algorithm that we ran, and we pre-specified all the variables that we were going to use before running the analysis. The specification of those variables was very much driven by the medical team. So this wasn't just a case of taking every single variable that we had in the study and throwing it in and trying to let an algorithm do what it does. This was very much done in conjunction with the clinical team, and a lot of that was designed to try and make sure that we were selecting variables that would be available if a subject went into the clinic. So ultimately, what you're looking at with analysis like this is to think about a subject who walks into a clinic. They're on some existing medication. It's not working for them. What course of action do they take? Is this? So this was a study in Relvar. So is Relvar the right drug for them based on their patient characteristics? And so you need information that's going to be available at that point in time. So there can't be things that we collected, obviously, during the trial. Also, obviously, because with a lot of these machine learning algorithms, you've got to be very, very careful with collinearity of variables. And so there was a lot of effort to make sure upfront that we were picking variables that were as independent as possible, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I ran the sites algorithm myself a couple of years ago, and like with any of these approaches, if you put too many covariates in there, it gets very, very fuzzy, and you just enter lots of garbage, and you very easily come into the curse of dimensionality that there's just too many options, and you need to pay quite a lot of a price for adding variables. So having a good kind of discussion with your overall team, with your medical team, to go through collinearity, go through some practical things is really, really helpful. One of the things that is specifically challenging for these algorithms are continuous variables, because if you want to find subgroups based on thresholds, and you don't want to describe kind of for a continuous variable how your the slope is, or you fiddle some other models. Did you actually pre-specify cutoffs for the continuous variables?
We didn't, no. So within the sides algorithm, you can specify the level of binning that happens. So, for example, you might take a variable like age and define that there will be there'll be 10 cut points, or maximum of 10 cut points, or 20 cut points, or 5 cut points, depending on how you want to how stringent you want to be. So we did that. We had a pre-specified maximum number of bins for the continuous variables. There's also a multiplicity adjustment that takes place for continuous variables and categorical variables with a lot of bins, so that you don't have those continuous variables dominating over things like sex, which is just a binary variable. So the algorithm handles it reasonably well itself, and therefore we decided not to pre-specify any of the bins. The other thing is, if you think of something like age, again, for example, we ran some pre-specified subgroup analyses as part of the primary study, where we cut age. I think the level was at something like 55, round about that area, where we split into two groups and looked at that already. And I guess when you're running analysis like this, the question comes up, well, is that the right place to cut? So rather than just feed in these pre-specified groups, it's like, let's have a look and see what comes out from the algorithm. And I suppose as a slight spoiler, the cut point that the algorithm found, because age was found to be important, was quite close to that. That was a decision that we took. But yeah, I don't think there would be anything wrong as such with pre-specifying it. I think it was just the desire of the study team to explore as much as possible that drove that decision.
Yeah, I think that is a trade-off decision. So if you let the algorithm choose the cut point, then you need to pay a little bit of a price in terms of the multiplicity adjustment. If you set it up front, of course, the algorithm can't tell you what is the optimal one. So I think there's no right or wrong. There's, you need to be conscious about, where you're going. So I think that's
actually, it wasn't, sorry, it wasn't actually just the continuous variables that were a challenge. So we had, in our uniqueness of data, we had things like deprivation. So we brought in, so Salford, for people who don't know the area, is generally a more deprived area in the UK, and there was a lot of discussion around how the deprivation of the subjects would affect their responses to medication, and so in fact we actually run an entirely separate analysis exploring deprivation. But deprivation, the way we categorized it was in twentiles. So you had a categorical variable that was effectively almost continuous, because you had 20 different deprivation categories that subjects could fall into, and there were several other variables that were very similar. So I guess that also partly drove our decision, because then you have to start trying to group some of those categories together, as well as picking your split points for your continuous variables too. So it was a big challenge for multiple.
Yeah, of course, kind of these ordered categorical variables, especially if they have lots of categories, as you mentioned, then you get the same kind of problems like with the continuous ones. Another topic is missing data in your covariables. How did you deal with that?
Yeah, so one really important respiratory measure that everyone outside of respiratory will always talk about, as well as those within respiratory, is FEV1, so your forced expiratory volume. And FEV1 was one of those variables where we actually had, it was round about 20% missing data across the subjects. Because again, it's important to recognize that whilst FEV1 is collected as standard in most respiratory COPD or asthma trials, in the real world, it's not collected so rigorously. So the way that the study was designed, we had 20% missing data for FEV1. So that was a really big challenge for us. Similarly with BMI, we had about the same. I think it was about 20% missing data for BMI. So what we did was we decided to run sensitivity analyses, basically excluding those variables from the analysis and running it on the remaining. the remaining variables, and then we ran two separate analyses. One where we added in FEV1, and one where we added in BMI, to see whether we were creating a similar tree at the end. And as it turned out, the trees were very similar. I think it was a subset of the full tree that we ended up with in the study for both FEV1 and BMI. But it was the same variables that were coming out. I guess the challenge then is interpretation, because you've got the missing data. What you don't know is the cause of that missing data. Were all the subjects that we didn't have BMI for? Was there a special characteristic of that we're missing? But I guess that's a missing data challenge in any study. But for what we could do with the sensitivity analyses, we did see some consistency.
So basically, you ran first your analysis on excluding these more problematic variables on all patients, and then for those patients that had FEV1, you rerun your analysis adding FEV1. Exactly,
a much more concise way of saying it than I said. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so another topic. Maybe we can first go into the sites method, because afterwards we can speak a little bit about how it actually handles combinations of variables and multiplicity and bias, because they're nice features in this approach that manage these kind of problems. So let's walk kind of step by step through the sites algorithm. What's the first step that it does?
So first, it's worth noting that there's various different control parameters in, but the first thing it will do is it will take all of your variables that you have and or that you've pre-specified, and it will cut them up into cut the data up by each of those variables. So, for example, if you have sex as a variable, it will partition the data into males and females. With a continuous variable like age that we've mentioned before, let's say you define 10 bins for age. What it will do is it will work out those cut points, and then it will create a binary split of your data at each of those cut points. So let's say those cut points were 20, 25, 30, 35, 40 years old. There will be a cut point at less than 20, greater than or equal to 20, less than 25, greater than or equal to 25. So you've basically created lots of binary partitions of your data based on every variable combination. And obviously, where you've got ordered categorical variables, you're effectively, in that example, age is an ordered categorical variable. You're splitting like that. If you have something that's not ordered and is categorical, you're looking at all different combinations of the sets, if that makes any sense.
So basically, you go through all the different covariates, all the baseline characteristics that you pull into there. Did you also look into post-baseline data? So, for example, whether kind of early changes predicted kind of overall outcomes or things like that?
So the only post-baseline variable we looked at was adherence. So again, we were the motivation for this was for subjects walking into the clinic. What information would you have at hand to decide what the best course of action was for that subject? So we tried to avoid any kind of post-baseline variables. The only one that we had was adherence that we'd collected during the study, and I think it's reasonable to, with the way things are changing now, it's reasonable to expect that you might have an understanding at that point of how adherent the subject is, perhaps if they're on some kind of connected inhaler system or something in the future. So that was the only one, but otherwise we stuck to baseline covariates.
Yeah, and I think that is quite a good point. It speaks to kind of the decision whether to start or not started treatment. If you include later on post-baseline changes, I found that quite helpful to then answer other questions like, given that you started and now you have this kind of initial response to treatment, would you continue on treatment or would you stop now treatment? So, or what kind of, treatment benefit can you expect now based on this decision? So, or the early treatment response. So that's possibly another thing to look into. Okay, so the sites algorithm has dehumanized all the different covariates at baseline. What's the next step?
So the next step is to then, and this is one of the input controls, is to look at the size of those splits. So you can specify a minimum subgroup size in the sides algorithm. So for example, if that age split that I mentioned, if you'd split and one of those cut points was at 20 years old and you only had 20 subjects, 20 or so subjects who were less than 20 and several thousand that were greater than 20, you've got very imbalanced groups, and you've got a very, very small group with the potential to see something really interesting in that group. But we would decide that was too small a group. So we specified a minimum subgroup size of 100. And I guess we were quite lucky because we had nearly 3,000 subjects in here that we could specify quite a large minimum subgroup size. But if you were trying to run this kind of analysis on a smaller study, then that would be a real challenge to think about what kind of minimum subgroup size you would have. So any kind of splits that result in very small subgroups were thrown away. We actually amended the algorithm slightly to also look at the number of subjects on each treatment in each of the two each of the partitions for each of the variables. So I think if I remember correctly, we had a minimum subgroup size of 100, and we had at least 30 subjects had to be on one treatment or other, because we didn't want any imbalances in treatment too. So a couple of controls. And then what you effectively do is run models on the subgroups. So what you're looking for is which subgroups have the largest treatment benefit. So for example, if you're looking at, if you split into males and females, which of those subgroups is your treatment having the most effect in? And you do that for each of those partitions on each of the variables. So you're taking all of those differences, and you're going to have a very simple model that you fitted to that data, and you can then take that forward and compare each of those subgroups that you've identified and the treatment effect that you found. You can compare that with the parent population. So again, let's say you'd found that males was better than females. You might then compare males to the parent population of males and females all together. Or if you'd found that subjects greater than 50 years old were had a greater treatment benefit than those that were less than 50 years old, again, you compare those subjects that were older than 50 with the parent population of all subjects. And again, here's where you have another control, because if you do that for every single variable, there's a large chance you're going to pick a high number. You're going to carry lots of things forward. But here we only take the best 5 subgroups. So we originally fed in about 30 variables, and that resulted in something like 80 or 90 different splits of the possible partitions of the data that we took forward. Of all of those, each of those 80 or 90, you're going to have one group that's better than the other in each of those. So of all of those different models that we fitted, you then take forward 5 candidate subgroups where you perform that comparison with the parent group. and the comparison is a very straightforward comparison. So the comparison is you're effectively comparing the p-value from the model with the parent p-value, penalizing it with some parameter gamma, so some number between 0 and 1, to adjust for the fact that
multiplicity.
Effectively,
Yeah. And so you describe the treatment effect not in kind of the absolute terms, but in terms of the p-value within the subgroup, which I think is a quite interesting thing. It's not looking into the interaction p-value or the treatment effect itself. It looks into the p-value within the subgroup versus the p-value of the overall group, which basically already penalizes a little bit for smaller subgroups, because these by design will always have a little bit bigger p-values. So that is it's kind of directly a balance between the size of the effect and the size of the subgroup, so to say.
Yeah, I'd fully agree with that. It's very nice, the sort of natural controls that there are within the size algorithm.
Okay, very good. So now you have your 5 candidates. So you have 5 from all the different binary variables that you started with. You have 5 candidates. What's the next step?
So taking those forward, there is then a resampling procedure that takes place. So this is again a kind of a weak adjustment of type 1 error. So you are resampling to see if you could find a random selection of data that performs as well as your candidate subgroup. So let's say you resample 1,000 times. If you can get more than 5% of those random samples beating your sample, then you might reject your subgroup based on that chance.
So here now, kind of, if we have these 5 variables that we start with, we look into the combinations. Also, whether you are, let's say you have age, sex, and some others, you look into how older females compared to the overall population, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So that is where kind of you look into. So basically, first you screen for promising variables on an individual variable basis, and now we are looking into the combinations of these variables and to find subgroups that depend not just on one variable, but possibly on a couple of variables. Okay, and what's the next step now?
So once you've adjusted, you might end up with some number less than or equal to 5 candidate subgroups that you found that offer this benefit over the parent population. Now that could be, as we said, that could be males and females. That could be older subjects less than 50, greater than or equal to 50, or any of the other partitions you've got. And of course, there's going to be overlap in those populations as well. But essentially, you've got up to 5 binary splits of your data, and at that point, you go again. So let's say you found males as one of your groups. You go again, males becomes your parent population, and you look at all the ways of splitting that population up again. So you look at males that are older than 50 or less than 50. You'd look at males that had, say, I don't know, less than or equal to 2 exacerbations in the previous year versus greater than 2 exacerbations in the previous year, and so on. And with each of those subgroups that you've identified, you just run the algorithm through again, and that keeps going until some pre-specified amount. So we specified a depth of 3 So you're going again each time so that you have a maximum number of 3 different variables that you're going to split by at the end. And of course, your tree
and that's where the tree comes in.
Yes. Yeah, your tree can look quite complex at that point. Because let's say you split on males, then you go down. The next thing you find that's important is that they're older than 50. Equally, one of the first subgroups you could have found would be subjects older than 50 had a benefit, and then you split that, and then you find males. So you can kind of find that the same story appears multiple times depending on which subgroup you split by first. You might then find another one, but it's not always the case. But it's giving you lots and lots of different candidate splits. And I suppose the interesting thing about sides is it just focuses on those subgroups of benefit. So if you found the group of males to be to have had greater treatment benefit, you effectively ignore the females then at that point. So you ignore the uninteresting space and just focus on the group that you have found, and try and further improve within that group.
Yep. Okay, now I have these trees. What happens next?
So you have the trees, and the trees are complicated because they're not like a standard decision tree, because many of the subgroups you're going to find are going to overlap. So for us, we found a tree with 3 levels. And variables we found. First one, we found subjects with non-current coronary artery disease, and that was the only split actually. So having coronary artery disease versus not having the disease in round 1, that was the only improvement that made it through all of the gates within sides. But then we further split into round 2. We had a split on age, a split on CAT score, which is the COPD assessment test, and polypharmacy, and then further splits around round 3. So we actually ended up with 8 different subgroups that were of potential, where the subjects in those subgroups saw a much greater treatment response than in the original population. And all of these, I think we started with 2,800 subjects, and all of these were sizable subgroups, all of them over 1,000 subjects in each of those subgroups. And there were a lot of patterns there. So of the eight different subgroups, there were only 4 different variables that came up. So the non-current coronary artery disease, the age, the CAT score, and the polypharmacy. In different combinations, those things came up in all of the groups.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found really nice about sites as well is you get a notion of what are the most impactful variables. Yep. So it tells you, okay, this variable has this big of an effect, and you get a rank of that, and you get a much better feeling of what are really the important ones. And that in itself is already quite helpful.
Yeah, and I think because this is the first time that anyone in the team had seen this, the interpretation was quite difficult. I mean, we ran through beforehand saying this is the kind of thing that you would expect, and we, to an extent, we actually had to explain the model a little bit without going into too much technical detail. But the key thing that I think that brought home the message was that these were the 4 variables that were coming up over and over again. As you say, ignoring the tree itself, actually everything is what you're trying to do is identify candidate subgroups, especially in the way we ran the algorithm. We did not create a validation set for the data. So we used all of the SLS data to train the model, with the idea that we at some point in the future will go out and be able to test this subgroup on external data. And so really as this was a very exploratory notion, just understanding what those, just seeing what the variables came out was the most interesting thing, rather than trying to look at specifically that subgroup and see what is the what is the additional benefit that we see within that particular subgroup. It's more the indication, the indication of which subgroups there were, which was the thing that we took home.
Yeah. That's actually one of the nice findings, that you actually got out with 4 subgroups. What would have been the interpretation if no subgroup would have come out?
That's a very, very good question. What would they have said? What would I have said? I think if you're seeing that there's no subgroups coming out, then I suppose, assuming all of your input parameters, which obviously you'd look at and say, is there anything we're doing that so, for example, one of the things you can control is this gamma value, this penalization on the p-values. Maybe you're being too stringent on that. We actually ran a gamma tuning exercise, which is extremely computationally intensive, but optimizes the gamma values for you, rather than just say choosing half at each level or something like that. So, but that could be something that you could look at to say, okay, were we too stringent on the improvement? But if not, then I suppose you're in a situation where you're not actually able to improve very much on the parent population. There's nothing obvious jumping out. I suppose I'm thinking about this for the first time because in all the kind of test runs and practice things that I've done around size, I've always found subgroups. So I've never really been in a position to try and interpret it. But yeah, I guess you have to conclude that your treatment, if you've already seen a benefit in the main study, is fairly unanimous in the benefit that it provides.
Yeah, I think that is one thing. The other thing that might be worth looking into is whether you were too broad in the input variables, so that you put too many variables in that, because you need to pay a price for that as well. And rethinking that might help. And I think for me, if you kind of run this and used a couple of different options, you can also play with the minimum bin size that we talked about. Is your treatment possibly works pretty consistently across all the known variables, and which could be a very, very nice thing in itself, because that means the outcomes of the treatments are quite predictable. Which makes it easy to use. So that's another outcome to look into. It could also be the initial research question. If you want to show that your drug works very, very consistent across all the different variables.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think actually the one thing that we did have to deal with the team is that, because you focus on specific subgroups where it performs really, really well, the question is then, well, what about the subgroups where it didn't perform well? And I guess if you're in a position where, like we were lucky enough to have a sizable treatment effect in the first place, and actually what you're doing is you're seeing sort of no difference in those subgroups that you've cast aside along the way, rather than a swing the other way in favor of the comparator group. But that's certainly a topic of debate if you see that. But of course, it's always important to remember that you're running this analysis statistically. For every time you find a group with a lot of benefit, you're going to find groups that are the opposite way as well.
Yeah,
that's worth bearing in mind.
Yeah, that's yeah, and actually that is one of the things that you need to look into at the beginning, because basically you need to say, okay, in which direction you want to look. Yep. So you can look into the direction, is it actually better? And a different thing would be to look into the direction, is it actually worse? So that is, I think, especially if you have head-to-head studies, so you have 2 active controls in there, or you want to look for you have a dose selection study and you want to look for efficacy, improvements for higher doses, or you want to look into safety for improvements for lower doses. These kind of things you need to have in mind when you actually start with it. Okay, very, very good. What were kind of your overall learnings with the study team at the end?
So there were a few learnings really. Obviously, this, as I mentioned a couple of times, is the first time this study team had been through this exercise. Actually, the first time I'd been through it at GSK, and fitting the algorithm to real data. And I guess the key learning that I had from this is you have an option when you start out with this algorithm as to whether you take if you like, a traditional machine learning approach of partitioning your data and keeping a number of subjects back to validate your findings, or whether you just use the whole data and then look for another study. Now, we use the whole data on this, but then we had the challenge of, because SLS was such a unique study, we perhaps didn't think enough about well how are we going to validate any findings, particularly if they're unusual. If they supported what we already believed, then great. But if we found anything unusual, is that a new promising finding, or is that random chance? And so we were left a little bit in a position where we were struggling to validate, because there were no other studies that had similar populations with the same drugs to test in. So it's something that's sort of still hanging there, that other teams are aware of, and it's not being the end for the algorithm. Sides has been run on various other studies at GSK, as are other methods, such as similar methods such as virtual twins have been considered. So the approach of exploring the data to find subgroups is being rerun, but this finding we've not been able to validate. So that was something we took away. I guess we did rerun the model of all the 8 subgroups that we found, the one that was best. We reran that, and we did see a real improvement over the original data. So originally in the study, we saw an 8.4% reduction in the number of moderate or severe exacerbations, and in this subgroup we saw a 21% reduction. So the 8.4% reduction was significant. Was significant anyway. So to go from 8.4 to 21, I mean, mathematically, we have found a group which performed a lot better. But some of that is the nature of the algorithm. You're going to find the best difference that you can, I suppose, within the data and within the bounds that you specify. But I guess it proved the mechanism that it worked to find this. Non-current coronary artery disease was something that even though we put it in as one of the variables up front, it wasn't one that anyone was really expecting to come out. So it threw up an interesting finding. So for that, I think the algorithm was definitely successful in that sense. It got us to the point where we were asking questions about the data, trying to look for an explanation. And there's obviously counterpoints there, and there'll be statisticians listening going, well, yeah, now you've seen this, you're trying to come up with reasons why you might see that, and there was definitely an element of that. People were coming up with theories as to why coronary artery disease and this particular split on CAT score would be important, but it certainly opens up questions and opens up the debate. So I think it was very successful in that sense, and that, barring the learning about really communicating the partition of data into training and test sets or training validation sets to the study team, I think the other main learning was that actually this was quite a productive exercise in understanding what machine learning can do with a data set like SLS.
In terms of these theories about why this variable is interesting, I find it quite good to have a good literature search at the beginning when you speak about the covariates that you want to put into them, so that the medics have a little bit a thought about the biology up front and really kind of test whether these are relevant variables and if they have real literature for that, because that helps to set expectations at the beginning. And of course, it also, you have some kind of hypothesis that you're testing. And you can prove where these hypotheses are coming from based on the literature. So I think that has a couple of advantages to move that way. Okay, very good. So there is lots of replications of that at GSK, obviously, which is interesting. In terms of further learnings on this, Ilya Lipkovich, who is actually the author on a couple of publications on that, and from which I learned the method directly when I was working in Lilly Neuroscience, has given another presentation in this webinar. So if you go to the PSI homepage, you will find the webinar there with the presentation from myself, from Andy, and from Ilya. And another person to mention is here Alex Dimitrenko, that worked together with Ilya on and was influencing all the multiplicity things. If you want to learn more from Alex, he has been discussing with me about multiplicity in an earlier podcast episode here. So just scroll back in your podcast player and you'll find that episode as well. And finally, in the show notes, I will, of course, put the links to this webinar and also the slides that were used in this webinar. So with that, thanks so much, Andy.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
This show was created in association with PSI, and next week we will talk about estimates another time, and this time we focus on the composite endpoint strategy. Really, really nice, with all the different applications and challenges and solutions for how to best use that strategy. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to enroll for the webinar. It will happen on May 30th, 2019, if you listen to this to a later date. So, looking forward to seeing you there. Bye.